Mín klukka orðin 12, ég veit ekki með ykkar. Verið velkomin á fyrsta hádegisfyrirlestur Þjóðminjasafns Íslands núna á hausti 2020. Fyrsti fyrirlesari þessa veturs Gavin Lucas frá fornleifadeild Háskóla Íslands og hann ætlar að tala um Hofstaði sem gamlar og alla leið fram í dagsins í dag held ég, Rannsóknir. Fyrirlesturinn á ensku og ég ætla bara að gefa Gavin orðið. Gjörðu svo vel.
Thank you for coming. So, as the title says, I want to really just give an overview of archaeological research that has taken place at the site of Hofstaðir, which stretches back more than 100 years. So I'm going to try and cover 100 years in 40 minutes or so. But I perhaps focus most on the period when I was involved in the project, which was the excavation of the Skáli, the main long hall. But I will be talking about the whole project. So.
Maybe you should talk a little bit louder.
Into the microphone. Okay. So it's important just to give some background to the site. It was of course relatively unknown in terms of literary sources. The site isn't mentioned in Landnámabók, Íslandabók, or any of the sagas or anything like that. So in some ways, at least in terms of antiquarian scholarship of the 19th century, it was an unknown site. But it first did crop up when there was a national survey of antiquities done in the beginning of the 19th century, where the site was first mentioned. There it more or less remained dormant for the rest of that century until the 1870s, when the Danish scholar Christian Karlund came in the early 1870s and in his tour around Iceland and mentioned the site in a little bit more detail. It's important to put the site, of course, in the context particularly of antiquarian scholarship in the late 19th century and the concern with linking the sites to the written sources, and particularly the importance of certain sites had in relation to pre-Christian religion, and particularly, of course, the name of the site, Hof, and referencing temple, and how those are almost like a temple mania, the need to kind of find lots of these temple sites in Iceland at this time. So by the turn of the century, 1900, there were about 100 sites claimed to be temple sites for Iceland, of which Hofstaðir was one. But the first real physical investigations into the site, of course, took place in the beginning of the 20th century by Daniel Brun, collaborated with Finnur Jonsson in 1908. Now, Finnur Jonsson, of course, was a philologist, and he was kind of quite interested in this kind of temple mania and took a very skeptical attitude and tried to kind of question a lot of these attributions. So the investigations of Hofstaðir were, in a sense, initiated as part of this kind of move to try and find a more kind of scientific or critical attitude to this kind of background in antiquarian research. So together, when they re-examined all these putative Hof sites around the country, they reckoned only about 4 or 5 of these 100 actually merited the title of being a potential temple, Hofstaðir being one. And of course, Hofstaðir was quite unusual also for its size, and that was quite recognized very early on. So in 1908, Brun did the excavations there, which are very well known and published in his work. And here's a contemporary plan of the site from his excavations. And what he found was what he argued was a very large banqueting hall with the temple at the top. So it's this kind of structure at the north end of the Skáli there was regarded to kind of be the kind of this inner sanctum, the temple area. There are very few finds recovered, and there were hints of other buildings that he found, particularly here. To the north as well. And then at the bottom, this circular thing you see was interpreted as a rubbish pit. He dug a small trench into that. Essentially, though, the size of the building and its particular form suggested to them that this was probably one of the few cases that could be legitimately called a temple, and it entered the literature and the textbooks and became almost a site type, a classic example of a temple site. As happens, of course, in disciplinary histories, later generations start to question the work of earlier ones. And some of the first kind of movements towards this were in the 1939 expedition to Hofstaðir, where the whole question of temples was being re-examined. And although Hofstaðir wasn't investigated in this expedition, it did kind of set up the framework for revisiting the site and rethinking it. And there was a continuation, of course, of skepticism over the use of literary sources to interpret the archaeology over the 20th century, which we're all probably familiar with. All of this culminated in the visit of the Danish archaeologist Olaf Olsen, who came back to the site in 1965, where his kind of ambition was much more limited than Bruun's. Obviously, he didn't want to re-excavate the whole site. He just focused on the circular structure at the bottom, which Bruun had interpreted as a rubbish pit, and dug a small trench into that to kind of get some sense of what that was all about. During his excavation of it, of course, he turned up lots of ashes and animal bones and firecracked rocks and so on, all of which led Olsen to reinterpret this rubbish pit as actually a large cooking pit. Now, this is a massive structure, it's several meters across, so obviously he was envisaging this as a cooking pit for big parties. But in that context, it therefore led back to reaffirm the idea that this was a major feasting hall, a major banqueting hall, perhaps with some ritual religious element, but the temple hypothesis was at least starting to be shelved or put to one side. Fast forward again 30 years to the beginning of the current project. Well, I call it the current project, of course, but this at least was the most recent phase of work, which is still ongoing and which is the main focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So in 1991, young archaeologist Adolf Fredriksson decided to kind of reinitiate another survey of Hof sites around the country, again, of which Hofstaðir was one. And basically we went around the country in collaboration with Mývatnssveit, and I also joined him. This was my first exposure, or my second exposure to working in Iceland. And we were surveying some of these putative Hof sites, including Hofstaðir, where we basically did a surface survey of the ruins and tried to get a sense of what the nature of these sites were. Needless to say, there's a lot of diversity in all these sites. All the sites that have the name Hof or Hofstaðir, they don't all have the same range of features, their own structures. There's so much diversity in what's actually there when you look at them that just saying something is a Hof kind of gives a false impression that they all share something in common. The following year, Adolf returned with Mjöll and Gava Gudmundsson and Orri Vestensen to dig a trench across the north end of Hofstaðir. This was a single trench. It was really just meant to kind of confirm the extent and limit of Bruun's excavations and also get a better sense of the dating of the site, which I think in some ways remained a little bit ambiguous from this trench, but they still recovered enough information to give a sense of how much Bruun had excavated and what was there, what was left, and what was preserved. And it turned out that luckily in some ways for us, Bruun had left quite a lot of the site intact, including things like floor layers and so on, which meant there was a great potential for further work at the site. They revisited the site again a few years later in 1995 to re-excavate Bruun's and Olsen's trench in that circular rubbish pit / cooking pit, and emptied out his trenches and dug further and offered yet a third interpretation, which turned out to be the real story behind this circular feature. It wasn't a rubbish pit, it wasn't a cooking pit, it was a pit house that had just been backfilled with rubbish. And it basically started to give a lot more information about the dating of the site and the range and the richness of the material on the site, because it was full with faunal remains, animal bones, fish bones, and artifacts, and so on. It was around this time that the thought basically coalesced to create a large project around this site, and so in '96 they invited foreign collaborators to join them on this project, primarily Ian Simpson, University of Stirling in Scotland, and Professor Thomas McGovern in New York. And that basically set the tone for the next several years of collaboration. And it was also in some ways the flagship excavation project for the newly established Þjóðminjasafns Íslands, the Archaeological Institute, which kind of basically managed the project from there on in. From that, the project and the excavations grew. So between 1997 and 2002, essentially the project just expanded and went underway. The foreign collaboration increased. There was an international field school initiated at the site, so with both foreign scholars but also Icelandic and foreign students coming to work on the site alongside the research objectives of the project itself. And so from basically a small team of 3 or 4 people, the project ballooned into maybe 30 or 40 people at the site in the peak seasons of excavations. So here you can see the progression of the excavations over time with the work. So in 1992 you got this small trench at the top, 95 reinvestigation of the circular structure, and then slowly working on some of the outside buildings, and then sort of more and more overall until the whole thing is exposed and excavated. And the Skáli was finished basically in 2002. With the final report coming out maybe 8 years later or so. So I want to now just give a little bit about what the kind of interpretation of the site was based on all this work, and give you a kind of very rough overview of what was found there and what the current story is, although the story, as we'll find out, is currently changing about this site. So first off, the dating. When we first started investigating the site, we assumed that there was landnam tefa present and that the site basically was pretty much established soon after that, but it was quickly realized that the tefa that we'd identified wasn't. It was actually a much later tefa. And based on the tefa, it was clear that all the activity on the site took place after 940 AD and was over by about 1104, if I remember correctly. And the radiocarbon dates more or less bear this out. So we had a whole suite of radiocarbon dates taken from different features of the site. Apart from one, possibly 2 rogue dates, most of them all fitted very nicely in the late 9th, late 10th into the early 11th century. So it's a fairly tight-lived occupation, but it obviously isn't the first settlement on the site. We're talking about, I guess, 3rd generation settlement in the country, if we're assuming the usual date of the late 9th century. So within that time period, quite a lot still happens, and the site undergoes still quite a lot of change. Broadly speaking, there are 2 kind of main phases to the occupation and the use of the site, but these are kind of very coarse blocks of time. It's very difficult to get the resolution down smaller than that. But in phase 1, we basically have 3 buildings on the site. We have the main hall itself, which possibly would have been smaller at this time. The evidence is a little bit dubious. What you can see now is the full length of the Skáli as it was later on, but there's some indications that the Skáli was possibly shorter than this. Based on the location of the fireplace and the symmetry of the walls, and also the location of the smithy. So we have 2 other buildings, the smithy here, which is a sunken, very shallow sunken pool building, and then the deep pit house down at the bottom, which was, of course, the rubbish pit, later cooking pit. The pit house had a little fireplace in. It was probably used for living in, but there was also clear evidence of a loom being put up against one wall. I won't call it a weaving shed, but it definitely had weaving activities going on inside it, but it was probably also a residential little unit as well. Whereas the other building I mentioned was a smithy. So it leaves the big hall as essentially the main kind of main large domestic dwelling on the site. I'll come a little bit later to the interpretation of that. But those are the 3 main structures that were basically established around the middle of the 10th century. Here you can see a view over the hall from the south end looking north. So what you're looking at here is area here with this fireplace in the centre, with kind of aisles on each side, and then very fragmentary traces of walls here. A lot of the walls have crumbled and disappeared, or also been slightly burned away by ruins. So the original wall probably came up to here, where the outer row of stones are marks the inside edge of the wall, and the outside edge of the wall is. And the inner row of stones just marks the location of probably benches or internal structural features. And then all these little holes of those walls supporting them. The floor has been excavated here, but the floor had survived, and it was basically thick charcoal ash from the fireplace that had been spread out over all the floors. A view of the pit house, not a great picture, I'm sorry, but you can at least see how deep it was and how access to it required a ladder. There was no, obviously, remains of a ladder that we found, but there must have been some ladder originally used to get in and out of the building. It had a low, rough bank wall from upcast going around the outside of the building. There's a fireplace in that corner, and I think the loom was possibly, yes, behind the fireplace at the top end, if I remember correctly. And then a view of the smithy, which was the other earlier structure on the site, which is a very slightly sunken feature with a little porch coming out. Again, the holes are just indications of post holes and stuff. This big hole at the top was where the forge was. It's all after excavation, I'm sorry, I can't really see what structures and features are in there. So this first phase lasted about, 40 years or so. And then at the end of the 10th century, or by the end of the 10th century, as I say, it wasn't like some magical moment where suddenly they built lots of new buildings. It probably happened piecemeal, but at least in terms of our ability to date it, by the end of the 10th century, the site had kind of changed with the addition of a lot more extra structures. The pit house had been abandoned, infilled, and was now used as a communal rubbish dump for everyone living there, which is why it gradually filled up with all that nice material that had been interpreted as a rubbish pit by Brun and cooking pit by Olsen. One of the smithy had also been abandoned and demolished, and a new smithy built in its place. The reason was partly because of building this annex here, it probably made the smithy not very functional there, but it also may relate to the fact that it might have extended the length of the hall, so the hall might have originally been not as big as it was, and might have made it very long. Other buildings, there's another dwelling house marked as area D here. Had a fireplace, kind of miniature timber hall structure, a latrine up here, a toilet with a porch kind of line coming out to get access to it, with seats for 3 people to sit in. A storage room here with a big barrel pit in the bottom. And then a structure at the top, which Brun had interpreted as a temple. And unfortunately for us, we couldn't interpret anything because the whole structure had been removed and dug out by a later structure from medieval times, 15th century or something. They basically reused the ruin of that northern structure and put in a sheep shed or something on the top. And they dug right down and removed all the floors and everything. So we have no idea what Annex C was at the top, and there's certainly no evidence to support Brun's interpretation of it being a little kind of a ritual temple or anything. So sadly, that will remain a mystery forever. And then, yes, the addition of a rebuilding of the new smithy, which almost looks identical to the old one. They built it exactly the same way with a little porch in almost the same location. Otherwise, the main hall more or less remained very similar. They removed the fireplace and made it slightly bigger. And again, this moving of the fireplace to make it more central is another indication that possibly the hall had been enlarged. So by the second quarter of the 11th century, the site was abandoned. So between 940 and 1030. We're talking about maybe 90 years maximum of occupation on the site, 3 generations of use on this site. So around 1030, the site becomes essentially abandoned. All the structures are no longer lived in, and there's very clear evidence for deliberate abandonment and closure of the site in the form of a number of ritual acts. The fireplace itself is clearly robbed and taken apart, but more importantly, more interestingly, there's these deposits of animal bones and skulls. So one of the intriguing things about the site is we found a large number of cattle skulls from the site that had clearly been slaughtered in a ritual act. They've been poleaxed to the head and decapitated, which was not at all, of course, the usual manner of butchery of these animals. And there's very good indication that these skulls have then been hung up and exposed to the elements, perhaps on the outside of the scowling. A lot of these were then all collected together in the abandonment phase and thrown into this annex here, along with a sheep who had been recently also killed in exactly the same way, poleaxed and then decapitated and thrown into the thing. So there's a clear sense of, in a sense, trying to close the site down and mark its end of habitation through some of these ritual acts, which, of course, you can start to interpret in all kinds of ways. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So once the site essentially becomes a ruin, after that, by the middle of the 11th century, it's basically left alone. There's some indication that the site was used or the ruins were used for storing hay or for piling up hay during the cutting of the home field, indicated by dumps or lenses of preserved organic hay material. But essentially the site was not interfered or touched with beyond that. So we finished the excavations in 2002, and then the final publication came out. When I say final, at least the interpretation of this phase of the excavations came out in 2009 in this book, which is also the basis of the exhibition here in the museum. And the interpretation that's put forward in the book, or that I suggest, is that basically Bruin got it right. It was a banqueting hall, a feasting hall, and there's a number of good reasons for arguing that. One, it's very, very large. It is, I think, my memory's bad on this, but 44, 45 metres long, which is very large for a hall. There are not many that reach that length, even though they do vary a lot in size. You've got these ritual acts going on in terms of the slaughter of the cattle linked to the site. The analysis of the animal bones from the site suggests a very strong high feasting profile, which is often indicated by the evidence of the killing of young animals, much more than you would expect for kind of a normal kind of husbandry practice, where you perhaps only kill off some of the young animals, but you keep them to an older age. But there's a very clear kind of feasting profile in the animal bone assemblage. Another indication that maybe this was not a normal domestic residence is the size of the hearth. If you compare the size of the hearth in terms of the relation of the size of the building, the hearth is minuscule. Okay, it's not going to create an awful lot of heat and warmth for a building this large, particularly over the winter months, which suggests again maybe this was a seasonally occupied building used for large gatherings of people, and perhaps it wasn't occupied, or at least large parts of it may have been closed off for other parts of the year. And as I said, it was a very short-lived occupation, from about 940 to 1030 AD. So obviously we don't use the word temple. We're not describing it as a temple, but it was a feasting hall where obviously ritual acts went on, and this perhaps is the more common interpretation in general these days. One doesn't really think of sites being exclusively devoted to religion always. That the ritual is incorporated into everyday life. Okay, but yes, these are points that one can discuss at length, of course. So that's where the excavations of the main hall finished in 2002. I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the work that happened after that, that also starts to maybe make us rethink the nature of this site. Because as well as, of course, being a feasting hall, obviously the size of it and the scale of it does suggest a certain degree of wealth and status in the area. And it does suggest that that there was obviously a chieftain or something living at this site, possibly. Now, so this is an aerial view of the shot. You can see the excavations that I can sort of here. The actual farm mound where the medieval farm was situated is not too far. It's over here. And then there's a church and chapel just to the north and the farm to the south. So, west. And then the modern concrete farm moved off the farm in the 20th century. Now, concurrent with the excavations on the Scowley, in 1999, they started also excavations, not so much on the farmland, but off the farmland itself, associated with the church and chapel. And these excavations were directed by Hilda Gestsdóttir, who will be talking all about this in more detail in another talk. So I don't want to spend too long on this, but just to give you some kind of a very brief background. So the farmland wasn't really investigated properly. Just the edges of it were clipped, just to get a sense of what was there, and then insofar as it connected to the church and the graveyard. But it's quite clear that from the small interventions that took place on the farmland, that we got activity going back there to the 10th century. Now, of course, one of the assumptions is that the first settlers who came to Hofstæðir built the Scowley, abandoned the Scowley in whenever it was, 1030, and then moved to the farmland. But we've obviously got activity on the farmland contemporary with the Scowley, so that theory no longer holds. It seems more likely that there was probably another Scowley under the farmland itself. Of course, that won't be confirmed until we actually dig the farmland. Maybe one day we'll get around to doing that. But that's the best, most likely scenario now. So we've got two Scowleys possibly at the site, one under the farmland and the large feasting hall that we've excavated. Further support for this comes from the dating of the excavations of the church and churchyard, which Hilda Gestsdóttir directed, and in two kind of blocks of time, one more or less concurrent with the Scowley excavations, and then kind of a later season to finish it. And her excavations basically uncovered, of course, the boundary itself, the circular boundary going around it, the graves associated with it, and at least two phases of church, with the first church dating back to the late 10th century. So that puts it smack contemporary with the Scowley. So we've got basically a church on the site at the same time as the Scowley, and possibly therefore also another Scowley maybe under the farmland. The first church was slightly larger, about 4 meters by 4, stave built, and it was replaced by a second church in the early 11th century, about 3 meters square, again stave built. The second church, the dating of when it stopped is a little bit uncertain, but we got pottery, I think, from the floor layers of it that date roughly to the 15th century. So, and we know it was abandoned by the late 15th century. It's clearly been a church on this location for quite a while. On the other hand, most of the burials, or all the burials, as far as we could see, are more or less predating 1300, and the graveyard totaled about 168 graves in all. As I say, Hilda will talk more about this in another talk. This is just to really give you a sense of what other work's been happening around the Scowley. But the work here has certainly then thrown up questions about the nature of the Scowley, as I mentioned earlier. What's going on? Is there part of another settlement on the site? We've got two settlements, essentially, at Hofstaðir, a large feasting hall, and then an ordinary site where the farmland later grew up. Well, the plot thickens. In 2016, Árni Einarsson at the Natural History Institute was looking at some maps of Google Earth and thought he spotted a structure much further to the north in the old home field of Hofstaðir. And the same year, Orri Vestensson went back to dig some trenches to investigate this and indeed confirmed there was more structures there dating to the Viking period. So we're talking about this area in blue under all this kind of thick vegetation, kind of beyond where the modern home field stops, so it wasn't terribly visible on the ground. So here you see a map. The modern home field is kind of dotted area, but the original home field is marked by this boundary, which we trenched as part of the excavations, again confirmed that the old boundary goes back to the earliest phases of occupation on the site. So in 2017, they did more trenching and investigation of this new site in Brekon and revealed that basically there's another hall there, a scowley there, and 3 other houses and even a possible burial associated with the site. Then further work's been carrying on in 2018 and 2019 with coring, which has suggested there may be more ruins scattered around the home field, particularly near the feasting hall itself. And then this summer, a team went back to start the excavation on one of these outhouses. I think the results we're still waiting to hear about what's going to happen with this. So, from a situation where we thought we just had one big chieftain's hall, feasting hall, possibly / temple or whatever, we've got a situation now where we may have a settlement with actually three farmsteads or 3 units on the site. One as yet undiscovered and still speculative scowley that may exist under the farmland and be associated with chapel, which was built in the 10th century, late 10th century, a feasting hall, which is also late 10th century, early 11th century, and then another scowley here, which is actually pre-dating at least this one, so it dates before 940. So potentially the earliest one is actually up here, but again, we don't know what's happening either. But it's quite clear if you look at the location of these 2 places, particularly the farmland and the one up there, they're kind of at opposite ends of this large enclosure. One can definitely imagine maybe 2 households living here, with this household constructing a large feasting hall at some point in the late 10th century, and then a chapel, and so on. Perhaps catering to both the pagan and the Christian. Anyway, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to go down this. But I think what it's shown up is that this site is turning out to be far more complicated than we first thought. If we thought Brun had painted a simple picture and we thought we'd answered it, this wasn't a rubbish pit, it was a pit house, it wasn't a temple, it was just a big feasting hall. It's clearly shown that our interpretation of this is also not as simple as we first thought either, and that the story here is going to be a lot more complicated. There's a lot more kind of information to get, not only from the new excavations at the top, but of course if we ever get to dig on the farmland as well, there's obviously going to add further information and understanding of this site. So, just to quickly end on basically show you a picture of what we've got up here for the latest findings in the north of the home. So we've got the hall here, small hall structure. How long it is, 20 metres, so obviously half the size of the feasting hall at least, and then various structures. So I think structure 3 is the one they're excavating this summer. I think they're just literally getting the turf off and starting to get into it, so we don't even know quite what's going on there. But it's clearly a self-contained unit. This little kind of settlement cluster in the north is clearly a separate residential area to the farmland and the feasting hall at the south. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. As I say, I've tried to give an overview of the whole project, and I've not been involved in all of it, so I can't necessarily fill you in on everything, but most of my knowledge comes with